Hello and welcome to the Wednesday, August 1st edition of the Cluster API breakout meeting for SIG Cluster Lifecycle. Today we are working on fleshing out our agenda, and our first agenda item is from Justin. Looks like you talked to some folks over at AWS, so I'm going to pick on you first, if you could give us an update there.
Absolutely, yes. So I think last week there was a question, I think you, Chris, suggested that there may be different rate limits on the APIs for AWS when you're launching instances through auto-scaling groups, as opposed to when you're launching them directly one instance at a time. And AWS did confirm that there are definitely different rate limits, at least for the top-level APIs. They didn't immediately have the numbers to hand. And I also think that we know that the numbers are sort of dynamic based on the load in a particular region. So, but there are definitely, it is definitely the case that there could be different limits on those two things.
Did AWS allude to a preferred choice, one over the other at all?
Not to my recollection, although, no, not to my recollection.
Okay, cool. Okay, thanks for the update there. And that's part of the continued discussion that we brought up last time as well regarding, moving forward, what types of patterns are we going to start seeing in the controllers? Do we look at following like a group approach where we would use like an autoscale group, or do we look at doing an instance by instance creation and mutation over time? Which we can add that to the end of the agenda today if folks have any thoughts on that as well they would like to bring up. But right now we'll move on. Our next one is the AWS design document from DWAT. If you want to, it looks like we have a link there. Let me see if I can make that link work. There we go. So we can pull that up. And if you want to give us a quick overview of what you have here, that would be helpful. Also, I cannot hear you. I don't know if other folks can hear right now.
Is this better?
Yeah, much better.
Okay. I mainly wanted to bring it to everyone's attention. I've started looking at it now, and I think it looks pretty good. Primary question I have is, what about cluster provider configuration? A number of the fields we're specifying for a machine, I think, should not be specified on a per machine basis. So little things like that. And then, if everyone's aware of it, I guess I wonder if there's a plan for when we would agree on the design, or at least the types. I don't know if we have any of the representatives here. Check.
So just to add to that a little bit, the work that we were doing at Heptio for our Cluster API POC on AWS just wrapped up. So we're working on documenting kind of the lessons learned out of that. And one of the things that is on my plate for this week is to actually add some details about Cluster API Provider to that document and help provide some more detail in that document in general around kind of where we see the proper approach to start will be.
I have a question. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Martin.
So why do you actually have a status field?
Okay, I think that was a question for the proposal here about, you're wondering why we do or we don't have a status field.
I'm sorry, Chris, was that to me?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering why there's not a higher level provider config in the document.
Okay. Jason, out of the work that you did with your POC on AWS, you mentioned you were going to put together a document. Does it touch on the API shape and perhaps directives that you used and didn't use at all? And then is that going to be shared publicly? And if so, where?
Yeah, so we're trying to balance kind of documenting all of the lessons learned and also trying to document the kind of public design document. So yes, we do plan to eventually publish the lessons learned doc, but I think the priority right now may be to go ahead and try to help evolve the design spec first.
Okay.
So this is Caesar. So so the question was, why is there a status? So the status, the idea of the status was to have something that's AWS specific in the status of the machine. Things like the instance ID and the instance state, which are not part of the regular machine status.
Sure. I wasn't asking about status. I was asking about the machine type and whether it wasn't a different spec that wasn't machine specific.
So, sorry, the machine type?
Yeah, machine type, correct. The machine provider type that you've created.
Okay, so this goes back to a discussion we had a while ago about whether cluster and machine needed to be provided to the actuator, and that there was no good way or nothing linking them to each other, right? So the only thing that to link a cluster and machine is the cluster. Is there a cluster in the namespace, and is it the only cluster in the namespace? Otherwise, the machine controller errors out, right? So the idea was that maybe we could do without specifying the cluster in the call to create machines in the actuator. Like anything that you would normally get from the cluster, they would sort of be trickled down to the machine. And then you would get rid of the ugliness of, right now, if you just add a cluster to a namespace that already has a cluster, you break your machine controller. Right. And there's nothing in the API server that prevents you from doing that. And so either we need a way to validate and enforce that restriction, or have an explicit link between machines and clusters so that then your machine controller can pass the right thing. So the idea of including some of the things that would normally belong in the cluster here was, coming from the thought is that let's assume that there's no cluster object being passed in. Let's get all the things that we need passed in to create that machine.
I see. Okay.
So I think another benefit that you have of being able to specify those on a per machine type is, even if you do keep the cluster to machine kind of relationship, it gives you an ability to override it either on a per machine or per machine set or per machine deployment basis as well. So if you wanted like a subset of your machines that, provided more CPU oriented instances versus memory oriented instances, that sort of thing.
That makes sense.
My comment about the status was the fact that right now in Kubernetes, when you have a status, it's normally a sub-resource of your main resource. And in this case, with your suggestion with having the status in the provider configuration, this means that every single time you update that status, every time you update the status, what was called, it will trigger a new generation. It will increment the generation in the metadata. So it means that mean, I think the most appropriate place for this thing is to have another sub-resource in the machine, like provider status, and there you should.
Sorry. So the it's probably not explicit in the doc, but these are separate types. One is meant to go in the provider config part of the spec, and the other one, the AWS machine provider status, is meant to go in the provider status field of the machine status start. So they're meant to go in different spec.
Okay.
What are we gaining from having a separate status in the provider config?
It's not inside the provider config. There are just two different types. One is meant to go in the AWS provider config. Spec is meant to go in the spec. The other one, the AWS provider status, is meant to go in the status part of the machine. I guess that needs to be called out in the doc explicitly to make it more clear that they're meant to go into the different parts of the machine.
Okay. In this case, it's okay then.
Okay. Any other questions on the proposal? And can we add a note to the proposal calling out the two different statuses and how they relate to each other?
I have one sort of question, which is like suppose COPS is going to use this. If there's more fields that COPS wants, not that I know that there are, would COPS embed this, or what would sort of how would the additional tooling extend this, or is there any thoughts on how that might work?
I think that's the point of the provider config, is so that you can have your own versioned set of fields there. And in this case, if we're trying to declare a standardized provider config, I mean, we could talk about the pros and cons of that approach, but ultimately, because it is an ambiguous field, we could adopt this, a portion of this, something completely different, or something that contains this and has something else in addition to it as well. So there's some flexibility there with such a leaky abstraction that I think we can extend pretty easily.
So like COPS would either try to add a field or create its own structure and embed the AWS configuration, I think.
Yeah. And, there's, we can talk about the implementation detail there, but there's pros and cons to how exactly that looks in code.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is just one other point. This is a versioned object, I think, right? That wasn't, so this has an object meta, I believe. And
yes,
in particular has yeah. Cool.
And by the way, I would love to get everyone's take on the idea of getting rid of cluster as a parameter to the actuator. It's the only part of the API where if you have that link between cluster and machine, and it's kind of awkward just because you can so easily break your namespace by just adding another cluster object.
I think that's true, but there's inherently linking between the cluster created components and the machine created components. And I think we either need to formalize, I think we probably need to figure out how to formalize that relationship rather than trying to completely remove that relationship.
Sure. At some point, Matthew Stabler had suggested having a local object reference from the machine to the cluster. And I don't think we got much traction with that. But it just feels ugly right now.
If I'm not wrong, in that discussion, wasn't there already a kind of consensus that we can add an optional field on the machine spec which can point back to the cluster? And the conclusion was more or less coming from the fact that in case we want to run both of the controllers, machine controller and cluster controller, separately in future, then that should also be possible. And just not make it compulsory, but as an optional field that could solve the problem, right? We could have a link from the machine to the cluster then.
Yeah, I think we talked about making that an opt-in feature and solving that, like how we track environmental variables in other parts of Kubernetes API definitions. I think, again, we're getting off into implementation detail for the controller. If the controller is going to respect such a link, so be it. That's up to the controller folks to decide. But yeah, I think having that optional field there is another viable avenue as well. Any other questions on this? Do folks want some more time to review it and us to look at it again? Or what is the sort of like end game here? Do we want to get a formal proposal to the AWS cluster cuddle repo? Any thoughts on next steps?
I mean, we can always evolve this, right? So if someone wants to do some coding, I don't think we should block on some sort of rubber stamp, right? It's not like this is we can evolve this as we go, and I don't think we're not going to declare it a stable v1 immediately. So
yeah.
Well, so I think there might be a problem with that though, because one of the rationale for adding that kind of explicit link was to be able to allow multiple clusters within a namespace, and right now that would throw an error through the cluster controller.
So maybe that we should follow up in an issue and have the discussion there.
Okay. Caesar, do you mind opening up an issue for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool.
And as far as this proposal, maybe, so should we have an issue, a proposal submitted to the AWS repo?
So Jason has a ticket, an issue opened against that repo right now that says rally around the spec. I don't know if that could be reused or if that's the appropriate place.
Yeah, I think that's a good starting point. If somebody is interested in opening up a pull request, I don't know. Oh, can we open up a pull request with just the proposal to the repo without actually writing any compilable code as a first step, and then maybe have a second PR that brings it in after we get that one through? What are folks' thoughts there?
Sounds good.
Okay. And I feel like a lot of these discussions about how individual controllers and cloud-specific work can be done could ultimately live in the office hours that we just started as well. Not saying that it's not appropriate to bring it up here, just saying that if we want to actually go through and click merge and work a little more dynamically as a group, we can start doing that during the office hours as well. Okay, any volunteers to open up that PR, or we'll just let it happen, lazy consensus style?
So I started the doc. I can copy the doc over to the PR, and then, yeah.
So are you talking about the doc for the link between the cluster and the machine, or the link or the doc for the AWS provider spec right now, Caesar?
For the provider and status field, that update we just discussed. Is that okay?
I think we're just like, we were bouncing two different.
So yeah, so one, we said we would open an issue to deal with the link between the cluster and the machines, and that's just a regular issue. For the doc, for the provider spec and provider status, we would actually create a PR with the doc. And is that acceptable?
I think that's a good starting point. I think having the issue for the link is a good place for folks to have that discussion. And if that ultimately turns into a PR downstream, that seems very independent of this other effort to get the AWS cloud specific definition, to get the ball rolling there and get folks looking at the API shape. Like Justin mentioned, maybe actually trying to code something with it, seeing how it works, and moving forward that way. So I think having those two different starting points makes sense to me and seems like a good approach.
Like, I have a question. I'm Jan from the cloud team. Does it make sense to follow like the same feature process we have for making proposals, or like is it okay to just use any template and start describing the actuator API for AWS?
I mean, I don't think we need to standardize on any formal proposal template yet. I think if it becomes a problem, we can, standardize on something then. I think for now, just best effort should be fine. I trust most folks here have written some sort of engineering proposal before. We don't have to go full KEP or anything like that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, like just to add to Caesar, what he said, like basically at this point, our main task is to update the design document for the actuator API, so we can start implementing as soon as we can, like basically anything that works that we can iterate on, and meantime, like folks can complain and say, oh no, this is wrong, or this is okay, and like just move with it forward, and then like it will either go to the main upstream repo or do not. So like basically at this point we are about to start implementing the prototype for the AWS actuator in our fork, and soon we plan to open a PR to the upstream repo where we can discuss like the next steps.
Okay.
Yeah, that's why having more than one, because I know we're working on stuff at Heptio. I know there's this proposal. It sounds like you also have one as well, Jan. That's why I suggested we do sort of a proposal as a first step that has these definitions in there, and then that gives us an opportunity to still have opinions and change things, and potentially start prototyping in the repo as well. And then once we have a little bit more data there, maybe standardizing on our findings and findings from other folks as well, to start an approach to getting an alpha AWS provider config.
Yeah, that's fine with me. Yeah.
Okay. Any other thoughts there? Or on the AWS proposal in general?
One small correction. So I just saw the notes. Tim, it said we have two status definitions.
Caesar, is there any way you could speak up a little bit? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. So just a correction on the notes where it says we have two status definitions. The status is only the machine status. The machine status has in it a field called provider status, which is of type raw extension. And what goes in there is what's being defined in the doc. So it's not two separate statuses. It's just what will be embedded in the provider status part of the regular machine status.
Okay. If you want to take a stab at updating the notes, go for it. If not, I will as soon as we get done with this next issue.
Sure.
Cool. Anything else on the AWS proposal here? Okay. Well, I think we have a good idea for next steps. The one final agenda item I had was I just wanted to check in and see if everything was working logistically with office hours. Obviously, we're going to start using them soon. If we don't have an update there, we can definitely punt until next week too, after we've had more time to run through the hoops.
I can say that I've missed it twice now because it wasn't on my calendar. I'd added it. I think somebody, maybe Robert, had an action item to add it to a team calendar.
Yeah, I also haven't seen that either. So I've been missing them as well. Okay, I know Robert's on a plane right now. I can ping him or try to add it myself, and then I'll bring this up again next week and probably at the end of a couple of calls moving forward, just to make sure folks are getting what they need to attend these. Cool, anything else in general? We're gonna have a pretty short call today.
Just something, if you go back to the API rate limits, so if I got it correct, AWS are limiting per hour or per minute requests, or what are the rate, more or less, what are the rate limits? If you know some, for example, I can create 100 machines every hour or something like this.
I think they're actually more like on the order of seconds of granularity. So like the one which everyone always hits is Route 53, which has like, I think, a global limit of 5 requests per second. Now, I don't know how that's actually enforced, like whether it's actually enforced over a 10-second window or something, but it's that sort of order of granularity.
I mean,
and that's a very low limit. Sorry.
Yeah, but right now, for example, with almost every controller, you can specify how many parallel workers can work on the, for example, on a machine, can reconcile a single machine. So if you have like 5, this means that you're going to do at the maximum 5 calls every second. Or I mean, depends on how fast you're doing things. So I'm not sure that it will affect us greatly. And even in that case, we have backup. In most cases, the controller should do like some exponential backup. And in that case, I'm not sure that the rate limits will affect us that greatly.
I agree with that. I think the issue is just that we can almost see what happens, but that the rate limit, if we go into back off, will mean that we create machines very, very slowly. And I think, if I recall correctly, a rate limited call counts as a call. So you might actually never make progress. But I don't hold me to that. And that like the actual rate limits are not actually documented anywhere, and it is documented that they are in different classes for mutating requests versus versus like read-only requests, and it is documented that they vary based on the load in a particular region, I believe. So if a region is under higher load, you will get a lower rate limit, but you can't actually see your rate limit anywhere other than by trying it. Until you hit it, you can't see it. I think it's one of those where we proceed without it. And when we have the problem, we ask AWS, and we also look at aggregation into a auto-scaling group or another mode of operation into an auto-scaling group. That's just my opinion.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're gonna have to solve this as well as a number of other AWS API issues as we start moving forward. Justin's smiling because we hit a lot of this stuff in COPS. But yeah, I think starting to call it out now, and it might even be a meaningful exercise to go through the COPS backlog and see some of these other concerns that we had to cross as we were starting this, building and creating and managing clusters with COPS over the past 2 years or so.
Yeah, the huge one was Route 53, which has really low limits. The biggest other surprise was, I think, there are some resources which you create which are very asynchronous, like network load balancers and IAM somethings, I think roles, but I don't think either of those are going to be in the sort of synchronous path, so we should be okay there. But yeah, instances seem to be relatively straightforward in terms of launching an instance. So fingers crossed.
Yeah. Yeah, I think even I know COPS, we have some retry logic baked into the tasks, resources, I forget the word, but looking at things like retries, looking at things like how do we structure API dependencies and which API call do we call first, and passing data back and forth. That's going to be a lot of what we're solving here, and a lot of that's going to be super specific to Amazon. Yeah. So that's just food for thought moving forward as this, the AWS bits here mature. Cool. Any other thoughts or agenda items for today? Okay. Short call. Have a good day, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, Ed. Bye.